German field strategist, vanished in 1944. 81 years later, his mountain planning room was discovered. Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into the shadow of a mountain that kept a secret for 81 years. A secret buried under limestone, silence, and the careful lies of a man who convinced an entire nation that he was dead. It is the spring of 2025. The Austrian Alps are still locked in the final grip of winter, the kind of cold that keeps casual hikers away and turns the narrow service roads above the Salzkammergut Valley into rivers of gray slush. On the morning of March 14th, a small crew of Heritage Survey workers contracted by the Bundesamt für Eich- und Vermessungswesen, Austria's Federal Office of Metrology and Surveying, are running ground-penetrating radar equipment along a ridgeline above the town of Bad Aussee, roughly 12 kilometers southeast of Altusee in the Styrian Alps. They are not looking for anything dramatic. Their mandate is a routine geological survey, part of a broader infrastructure assessment connected to a proposed expansion of a regional cable car route. They are cataloging subsurface rock density, looking for fault lines, checking for cavern systems that might undermine construction. The kind of work that produces spreadsheets, not headlines. At approximately 10:40 in the morning, the ground-penetrating radar unit operated by surveyor Magdalena Hofer returns an anomalous reading. The signal bounces back wrong, not the dense, uniform reflection of solid limestone, but the unmistakable hollow echo of a sealed artificial void. Hofer marks the spot with a bright orange flag and calls her supervisor, Andreas Brenner, over to look at the readout. Brenner stares at the screen. The cavity is large. The radar suggests a rectangular space approximately 14 meters long, 6 meters wide, and nearly 3 meters in ceiling height. This is not a natural cave formation. The geometry is too precise. The walls are too regular. Someone built this. They bring in a drill team 4 days later. On March 18th, a narrow borehole is sunk through 2 meters of rock and compacted earth reinforced with what proves, on analysis, to be early pattern German military specification concrete from the mid-1940s. When the drill breaks through, Brenner presses a fiber-optic camera into the opening. The image that appears on his monitor stops every person on that ridge cold. The room is intact, not collapsed, not flooded, not degraded by 80 years of mountain weather. Whoever sealed this chamber in 1944 or 1945 did so with extraordinary engineering care. The fiber-optic camera sweeps slowly across the space and reveals a long wooden table running the length of the central chamber. On that table, still laid out as though the man who placed them there might return at any moment, are topographic maps. Hand-annotated maps of the Eastern Front, of alpine terrain, of what appear to be supply corridor routes through Yugoslavia and northern Italy. Beside the maps, a leather-bound planning journal, a German military field compass in a brass case, a portable shortwave radio set, 2 metal ammunition canisters containing documents, and most extraordinarily, propped against the far wall inside a sealed wooden case, a framed photograph of a man in the uniform of a Wehrmacht Generalmajor, standing in front of a mountain landscape, smiling. On the back of the photograph, written in a careful, precise hand in blue-black ink, are 7 words in German. Ich werde zurückkommen, ich war nie tot. I will return, I was never dead. The identity documents found in the first ammunition canister are examined on-site by the survey team's liaison officer, Dr. Friederich Kastner of the Österreichisches Staatsarchiv, the Austrian State Archive, who had been called in as a precautionary measure after the initial bore results. What she finds inside that canister does not stay quiet for long. The documents include a Wehrmacht service record, a Soldbuch, a military pay book, and a death notification form bearing the official stamp of the Wehrmacht Personnel Office, Berlin, dated November 3, 1944. The form declares with bureaucratic finality the death in action of Generalmajor Karl Heinrich Voss, born June 7, 1901, in Kassel, Germany, commanding officer of the 157th Reserve Division Alpine Planning Staff. Officially killed near the Semmering Pass during the chaotic withdrawal of German forces from the Eastern Front approaches. Officially dead for 81 years. But the journal on that table is dated in entries running from November 1944 through March 1945, and the handwriting in the journal matches, according to the preliminary analysis Dr. Kastner conducts right there on the mountainside, the handwriting on the photograph. The man who was officially killed in November 1944 was still writing in this room months after his declared death. He was planning something. And based on what investigators would spend the next several weeks pulling out of that sealed chamber, he had planned it with the same methodical precision that had made him one of the most effective strategic minds in the Wehrmacht's mountain warfare divisions. If you want to see what investigators found when they finally opened that room completely, what was inside those canisters, what the journal reveals, and where Karl Heinrich Voss actually went, hit the like button and subscribe right now. And drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from tonight and what time it is there, because we are doing this journey across the globe together, one revelation at a time. Let's go. To understand how a man could vanish so completely from the record, how a senior Wehrmacht officer could fake his own death with such precision that the deception held for 8 decades, you first need to understand exactly who Karl Heinrich Voss was, because Voss was not an ordinary soldier. He was not even an ordinary officer. He was, by the assessment of his contemporaries and the grudging admiration of his enemies, one of the most intellectually formidable operational planners the German military produced in the entire Second World War. Karl Heinrich Voss was born on June 7, 1901, in the industrial city of Kassel, in the heart of the German state of Hesse. His father, Wilhelm Voss, was a civil engineer who worked on railway infrastructure throughout central Germany, and from his earliest years Karl absorbed a particular way of thinking, terrain as problem, movement as solution, logistics as the true foundation of any successful enterprise. He was a quiet child, teachers noted, but unusually precise. Not brilliant in the showy, performative way of academic prodigies, but possessed of a methodical intelligence that never wasted a single step of reasoning. He solved problems the way his father built bridges, by understanding the load before choosing the material. He entered the Reichswehr, the post-World War I German military, in 1921 at the age of 20, passing the officer candidate examination with scores in the top 3% of his cohort. He was assigned to the 7th Infantry Regiment in Munich and spent the decade of the 20s developing the specialized expertise that would define his career: mountain warfare logistics and terrain-adaptive strategic planning. The Alps were not, in the 1920s, considered a priority theater for military planning, but Voss saw them differently. He wrote a paper in 1927 while attending the Advanced Tactical Studies course in Dresden, arguing that alpine terrain would become the decisive strategic factor in any future European conflict fought in the Southern Theater. The paper was noted, filed, and mostly ignored. 17 years later, his thesis would prove correct in ways even Voss had not fully anticipated. When the Wehrmacht replaced the Reichswehr after Hitler's rise to power in 1933, Voss navigated the transition with the careful political neutrality of a man who understood that survival required a certain strategic ambiguity in all things, not merely military operations. He was not a Nazi ideologue. The officers who served under him and survived to write memoirs after the war consistently describe a commander who showed no interest in party politics, who attended the mandatory functions with visible boredom, and who directed all of his considerable mental energy toward the purely professional question of how to move troops and supplies through difficult terrain faster and more reliably than any enemy could manage. He joined the NSDAP in 1937, the same year he was promoted to Oberstleutnant, but did so, by all subsequent accounts, because it was professionally necessary, not because he believed in anything the party represented. By 1939, Voss had been promoted to Oberst and assigned to the OKH, the Oberkommando des Heers, the Army High Command, as a specialist in alpine and mountain terrain operational planning. His work during the invasion of France in May and June of 1940, specifically his contribution to the planning of German forces moving through the Ardennes, an area many planners had dismissed as impassable for armored units, earned him a personal commendation from Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch and accelerated his promotion trajectory considerably. In January 1942, he was promoted to Generalmajor, the rank of Brigadier General, and assigned to command the planning staff of the 157th Reserve Division, then stationed in northern Italy and charged with maintaining the Alpine defensive network against potential Allied incursions through Yugoslavia. His personal life during these years was shaped by a grief that those who knew him say fundamentally altered something in his character. Voss had married Else Maria Brandt in 1928. They had two daughters, Katharina, born 1930, and Ingrid, born 1933. In August 1943, during an Allied bombing raid on Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah, the devastating series of air attacks that killed approximately 45,000 civilians, Else, Katharina, and Ingrid Voss were killed in their apartment building on Eppendorfer Baumstrasse when the structure collapsed from incendiary bomb damage. Voss received the notification while commanding a planning review in Trieste. Witnesses said he read the telegram, folded it, placed it in his breast pocket, and returned to the briefing without a word. But something broke in him that day, in the slow, quiet way that structural failures sometimes begin, not with a crack but with an invisible fracture in the deepest foundation. The Karl Voss who emerged from Hamburg's ruins was a man who had lost his last personal investment in the outcome of the war. His wife was gone. His children were gone. The Germany they had inhabited together was being systematically incinerated from the air. What remained was the professional, the planner, the strategist, the man who still got up every morning and moved pieces across maps, because it was the only language left that still made sense to him. By mid-1944, it was apparent to any officer with Voss's analytical clarity that Germany was losing the war. The Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, combined with the catastrophic German losses at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 and the ongoing collapse of Army Group Center in the east, had created a strategic situation that no amount of brilliant planning could reverse. Voss was not delusional. He could read a map. He understood operational mathematics. He knew that the Wehrmacht he had served for 23 years was moving toward a defeat as total as anything in European military history. What made Voss uniquely capable of orchestrating the disappearance he was apparently already planning by the autumn of 1944 was precisely the same quality that had made him valuable to the Wehrmacht. He understood terrain, movement, and logistics at a level that most people never reach. He had spent his career studying how to move people and materials through difficult environments without being detected, intercepted, or delayed. He had spent years building relationships with officers and officials across the Alpine network, Austrian, Italian, Hungarian, Croatian, who owed him professional favors, respected his competence, or were susceptible to other forms of persuasion. He had access to resources, to communications, to maps that no civilian could ever obtain. And he was, at 53 years old, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain by becoming someone else entirely. The official record says that Generalmajor Karl Heinrich Voss died on November 1, 1944, near the town of Glognitz, approximately 90 kilometers south of Vienna, during the chaotic retreat of German units before the advancing Soviet forces. The record says his vehicle was struck by artillery fire, that the resulting explosion and fire made identification of remains impossible, and that two enlisted men who had been with him submitted sworn statements confirming his death. The Wehrmacht Personnel Office accepted these statements, processed the death notification, and closed the file. But the evidence tells a completely different story. October 28, 1944, 9 days before the official death of Generalmajor Voss. The situation on the Eastern Front south of Vienna has become, in the space of 3 weeks, a rolling catastrophe. The Soviet Second and Third Ukrainian fronts under Marshals Malinovsky and Tolbukin are driving westward with a ferocity and operational momentum that has overwhelmed 3 German defensive lines in succession. Budapest is encircled. German Army Group South is fragmenting under pressure that the Wehrmacht simply cannot absorb with the depleted forces available. The road network south of Vienna, the roads that run through the Semmering Pass and down through Styria toward the Italian frontier, is choked with retreating German units, displaced civilians, Hungarian refugees, and the full, terrifying disorder of a collapsing military front. Voss is at his planning headquarters in Graz, in the fortified cellar of a requisitioned textile factory on Kaiser Franz Joseph Kai, when he makes the final decision. He has been planning this for months. His journal, the journal found in the mountain chamber 81 years later, contains the earliest reference to what he calls, in coded language, Project Alpenrückkehr, Alpine Return, in an entry dated July 19, 1944, 6 weeks after the Normandy landings. By October, the plan is complete. The timing is nearly perfect. The chaos of the collapse is, paradoxically, the best possible cover. The evening of October 28th, at around 8 p.m., Voss summons 2 men to his planning room. They are Hauptmann Werner Schäfer, his chief signals officer, a 32-year-old career military communications specialist from Stuttgart, and Feldwebel Hans-Georg Mauer, his personal driver and, more importantly, a man who had been born in the Salzkammergut Valley and knew every mountain road, forest track, an unmarked path in the region with the intimacy that only a native childhood can provide. Voss dismisses his other staff. He locks the door. He spreads a topographic map across the table. What is discussed in that room over the next 3 hours will not be documented in any official record, but the mountain chamber, opened in March 2025, contains Voss's own detailed account of everything that was decided. The plan is audacious in its simplicity. Voss will not run. He will not flee in the night like a deserter. Instead, he will die. He will die officially, provably, with witnesses and documentation, in a manner that the Wehrmacht bureaucracy, drowning in a flood of actual deaths across 100 fronts, will process and file without question. To accomplish this, he needs 3 things: a body, or a sufficiently convincing substitute for one, 2 reliable witnesses who will swear to his death, and a destination that no one will ever think to look. The body problem is solved by a grim coincidence of war. On October 30th, Voss identifies a fatally wounded German corporal, Konrad Baumann, 22 years old, from Nuremberg, whose wounds from Soviet artillery are untreatable, and who has perhaps 48 hours remaining in the military field hospital established in the textile factory's upper floor. Baumann is roughly Voss's build, though younger. Voss visits him. He speaks with him quietly. What he tells Baumann, his journal records, is the truth: that Baumann is dying, that nothing can save him, and that his death can, if Baumann is willing, serve a purpose beyond the war. In exchange, Voss promises to find Baumann's family after the war. There is a mother in Nuremberg, a younger brother, and ensure they are provided for. Whether this promise was ever kept is a question that investigators in 2025 are still trying to answer. November 1st, 1944, the critical day. At approximately 6 a.m., Voss supervises the loading of 2 metal ammunition canisters, the same canisters that will be found in the mountain chamber 8 decades later, into a Wehrmacht supply truck driven by Mauer. The canisters contain the planning journal, documents, maps, and personal items that Voss considers too valuable or too dangerous to destroy. He also loads a sealed wooden case containing his personal effects, the framed photograph, the field compass, and a portable shortwave radio. At approximately 9 a.m., the Wehrmacht vehicle carrying Generalmajor Voss, with Hauptmann Schäfer in the passenger seat, departs Graz heading southeast toward Glognitz. Mauer follows separately in the supply truck, taking a different route along the western side of the valley. The plan requires Mauer to be nowhere near what is about to happen. At approximately 11 a.m., near the village of Schottwien, approximately 5 kilometers northeast of Glognitz, Voss's vehicle stops at a road that has been blocked by a collapsed bridge. This is not an accident. Schäfer had arranged, 3 days earlier, for a demolition team to take out the bridge under the pretext of denying it to Soviet forces. The road is effectively deserted at this hour. The main military traffic has shifted to the parallel route through the valley floor. What happens next takes approximately 20 minutes. Voss changes out of his uniform. He removes his Generalmajor's insignia, his identity documents, his Iron Cross. He dresses in civilian clothing, a heavy wool coat, mountain trousers, walking boots, that has been hidden in the vehicle's trunk since Graz. Konrad Baumann, who has been transported from the field hospital in the back of the vehicle under a canvas cover, is already dead. He died sometime before dawn. Schäfer places Voss's uniform, his identity documents, and his soulbuch on or near Baumann's body. 2 Wehrmacht engineers, both in Schäfer's signals unit, both subsequently listed as killed in action before the end of November 1944, a convenient coincidence, pour accelerant on the vehicle and the surrounding brush. The vehicle is ignited. Schäfer and the engineers withdraw to the main road. At approximately 11:25 in the morning, Generalmajor Karl Heinrich Voss ceases to exist. He walks south through a forested hillside in civilian clothes, carrying a single canvas rucksack, toward a rendezvous point that Mauer has been moving toward since 9 a.m. The rendezvous point is a forester's hut approximately 4 kilometers south of Schottwien, in the lower slopes of the Rax Massif. Voss has been to this hut before. It belongs to a man named Leopold Huber, a retired Austrian forestry official who has been in contact with Voss since the summer of 1944. Huber is one of at least 4 key individuals in what investigators will eventually identify as the Escape Network's Austrian segment. By 2 p.m., Voss is inside the forester's hut. By 3 p.m., Mauer has arrived with the supply truck and the 2 metal canisters. By nightfall, they are moving again southwestward now, along forest tracks that Mauer knows from childhood, heading deep into the Salzkammergut. The mountain room was prepared over the following week. Voss's journal entries from this period describe the engineering work, blasting a sealed chamber into an existing natural fissure in the limestone ridge above Bad Aussee, pouring the German military specification concrete that Brenner's survey team would identify 81 years later, installing the ventilation system that would keep the interior dry and stable for 8 decades. The work was done at night, using materials Huber had been quietly stockpiling for months. By November 10, 1944, the chamber was sealed. The equipment was installed. The maps were laid out on the table. The room was never meant to be a permanent hiding place. It was a planning station, a node in a larger network. Voss intended to use it for months, maintaining communications with other network members, coordinating the next phase of his escape while the chaos of the war's final months swept across Central Europe and obliterated the evidence of what he had done. Meanwhile, back in Glognitz, Hauptmann Schäfer had completed his role. He reported to the nearest Wehrmacht command post that Generalmajor Voss's vehicle had been struck by Soviet artillery near Schottwien, that the resulting fire had been total, and that he, Schäfer, was the sole survivor. He produced a second witness, one of the engineers who corroborated the story. The Wehrmacht Personnel Office, processing hundreds of similar reports from a front that was collapsing across 400 kilometers, accepted the account without investigation. Karl Heinrich Voss was dead. The war ground on for another 6 months without him. March 22, 2025, Bad Aussee, Styria, Austria. The sealed chamber above Bad Aussee is now fully open. It has taken 10 days since the initial bore discovery for Brenner's survey team, now augmented by a joint task force assembled with remarkable speed, to create an access shaft wide enough for investigators to enter the room. The task force includes Dr. Friederike Kastner from the Österreichisches Staatsarchiv, Professor Dieter Halsmann of the Institut für Zeitgeschichte at the University of Vienna, forensic document specialist Dr. Annelies Wurm from the Bundeskriminalamt, the Austrian Federal Criminal Investigation Service, and a representative from the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, Germany, the German Federal Military Archive, Major Reserve Officer Stefan Kruger. The first full entry into the chamber occurs at 9 a.m. on March 22nd. Dr. Kastner and Dr. Wurm go in first, wearing sterile processing suits, carrying halogen work lights and photographic equipment. The ambient temperature inside the chamber, according to Brenner's instruments, is a steady 8 degrees Celsius. The humidity is low, remarkably low for an alpine cavity, because investigators will determine Voss or his engineers installed a passive ventilation system that channels dry mountain air through a series of stone-baffled shafts running upward into the limestone above. The system, designed in the 1940s, has functioned without maintenance for 81 years with sufficient effectiveness to preserve paper, leather, and wood in near-archival condition. Dr. Kastner photographs every item in situ before anything is touched. The documentation process takes 6 hours. What the photographs reveal, even before any item is moved or opened, is staggering in its implications. The topographic maps on the central table are Wehrmacht tissue, printed between 1942 and 1944, hand-annotated in at least 3 different inks suggesting multiple working sessions over time. The annotations include route markings, safe house locations indicated by small coded symbols, border crossing points, and what appear to be communication schedules rendered in a simple substitution cipher. Dr. Halsmann, examining the photographs that evening in the command tent set up outside the access shaft, immediately recognizes several of the geographic references. The maps show the full length of what historians would later identify as the southern variant of the escape network that has been partly documented in post-war research, but never with this level of operational detail. The planning journal contains 147 handwritten pages in a small, precise German script. The entries run from July 19, 1944, the first mention of Project Alpenrückkehr, through March 8, 1945. The final entry reads, in Dr. Kastner's translation, "The route is confirmed. Maurer leaves tomorrow for Innsbruck. I depart in 4 days through the southern corridor. Whether I write again in this book or in another language entirely, I leave this room as I intended, having thought clearly, acted precisely, and survived what was undeserved. For else, for Katharina, for Ingrid, the war took them. I have denied the war the final satisfaction." The entry is dated March 8, 1945, 80 years to the day before this script is being written. The forensic analysis of the journal begins immediately, conducted by Dr. Wurm using portable spectrographic equipment brought to the site. The ink on the pages is consistent with German military-issue black-blue fountain pen ink manufactured between 1940 and 1945. The paper is a high-quality rag paper, matching the specifications of German military planning journals of the period. More significantly, a series of fingerprints found on multiple pages, where Voss apparently pressed his hand flat while annotating maps, are clear enough for analysis. On March 28, 6 days after the initial entry, a connection is made that transforms the investigation from an interesting historical mystery into an extraordinary chain of evidence. Major Kruger, working in parallel with the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, has located Karl Heinrich Voss's service record. The original service record, unlike many Wehrmacht documents, survived the war intact. It was captured by American forces at the OKH Records Depot in Zossen in May 1945 and eventually transferred to the German Federal Archives. The service record contains, among other things, Voss's fingerprints, taken at his initial commissioning in 1921 and again at his promotion to Generalmajor in 1942. The comparison takes 4 hours. The fingerprints match. The man who sat in that chamber above Bad Aussie writing in that journal in the winter of 1944 and 1945 was, without any forensic doubt, Karl Heinrich Voss. But the investigation is only beginning, and what investigators find in the second ammunition canister expands the scope of the case dramatically. The second canister contains 37 individual documents of varying sizes and types. Among them, 3 sets of forged identity papers in different names, all Austrian civilian identities, all prepared with the kind of professional quality that suggests access to either official document production equipment or a highly skilled forger. The identity papers are for a Karl Hubert Steinmann, an Austrian engineer born in Linz in 1902, a Heinrich Werner Haller, a Swiss national of German descent born in Basel in 1899, and a Karl Linder, an Austrian forestry official born in Klagenfurt in 1900. All 3 sets of documents include forged residence permits, work authorizations, and in the case of the Steinmann identity, a Swiss Red Cross civilian registration card dated November 1944, a document that would have been nearly impossible to obtain except through a network with access to Red Cross operations in the Alpine region. Dr. Worm's analysis of the forged documents is completed on April 5th. She presents her findings to the full investigation team in a briefing room hastily established in a rented space in the Bad Aussie Town Hall. Her conclusion: the documents were prepared using a combination of genuine blank document stock, almost certainly stolen from Austrian civil registration offices, and printing equipment of the type used by the Wehrmacht's own propaganda and psychological warfare division, the Abteilung Fremdheer. The level of skill required, she states, is not that of an amateur forger, but of someone with professional training and access to official resources, someone inside the system. This finding directs the investigation toward one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case, the scope of institutional involvement. Because Voss, it becomes clear, was not working alone. He was working within a network that had, by late 1944, been quietly constructing escape infrastructure for at least 18 months. Among the 37 documents in the second canister are 11 letters, sealed with wax that has been intact since the 1940s. When opened under laboratory conditions and analyzed, 7 of these letters proved to be correspondence between Voss and network contacts, individuals identified only by single-letter codes or by operational names. 2 letters are addressed to a contact named only as Der Stieglitz, the Goldfinch, and contain coded references to route segments through northern Italy and the South Tyrol. 3 letters reference a contact in Geneva identified as Die Brücke, the bridge, who appears to have been a Swiss national with connections to the International Committee of the Red Cross. The remaining 4 sealed letters are personal. They are addressed to Maine Schatz, my treasure, and to Maine Lieben Terchter, my dear daughters. They are love letters to a wife and children who died in Hamburg in August 1943. Voss, it appears, wrote to them throughout the months he spent in the mountain chamber, writing letters that could never be sent, speaking to the dead with the same precise, careful prose that characterizes his operational planning. These letters are, according to Professor Halsman, who reads them aloud to the assembled team on April 6th, among the most devastatingly private documents to emerge from any Second World War investigation in decades. The room, by all accounts of those present, is completely silent when Halsman finishes reading. But the investigation cannot dwell in grief for long, because what the letters to the dead reveal between the lines of private sorrow are details of the escape plan, routes, timing, contacts, that Voss apparently worked through even in his most personal writing, as though planning and grief had become, for him, inseparable processes. On April 10th, investigators make the discovery that connects the Bad Aussie chamber to the broader historical record in a way that no one had anticipated. Among the coded route annotations on the topographic maps, Dr. Halsman identifies a specific location marked with the symbol that appears in the letters to Der Stieglitz to denote a major network safe house. The location is a farmhouse near the village of Toblach in the South Tyrol, a location that appears in two other post-war investigations into what historians call the Kameradenwerk, the network of organizations that assisted the escape of former SS and Wehrmacht officers after the war ended. The Toblach farmhouse connection means that the Voss escape network was not an isolated personal operation. It was a node in a larger system. The full reconstruction of Voss's escape route, assembled by the International Investigative Team over 6 weeks between March and May 2025, draws on evidence from 5 countries: Austria, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and Argentina. It is the most complete operational picture ever assembled of a single escape from Germany's collapsing military structure in the final months of World War II. Voss departed the mountain chamber above Bad Aussie on approximately March 12, 1945, based on the dating in his journal and the March 8 final entry, which references a 4-day remaining period. He was traveling as Karl Hubert Steinmann, the Austrian engineer, carrying the Steinmann identity papers and a single case containing personal items and a quantity of gold, specifically 42 pre-war Swiss gold coins and 14 gold bars of the type issued as Wehrmacht special allocation assets, each weighing 100 grams, with a combined 1945 value sufficient to sustain a man for several years of comfortable living in any neutral country. The gold is documented in a detailed financial accounting in the planning journal, written in Voss's characteristic methodical style, with the same emotional neutrality he applied to troop movement statistics. The journal records the source of the gold as 2 separate transfers: 12 coins from Voss's own pre-war savings, converted to gold in 1938 on the advice of a Castle banker friend, and the remaining coins and all 14 bars from what he describes only as the Graz allocation, a phrase that investigators believe refers to a portion of the Wehrmacht's special reserve funds held at the Graz military district headquarters, from which Voss, as a senior planning officer with legitimate access, had diverted resources over several months in 1944. From Bad Aussie, the route moves southwest. The first waypoint, reached on approximately March 13th or 14th, is a guest house in the small market town of Schladming, in Styria, where a network contact identified in the documents as Hauptmann A maintained a room reserved, under a standing booking, for individuals traveling under the network's auspices. Investigators identify Hauptmann A in April 2025 as Owa Riedler, a former Wehrmacht supply officer who had been living in Schladming under his real name after being processed through Allied denazification as a low-priority case in 1946. Riedler died in 1978. His family, contacted by investigators, has no knowledge of any wartime escape network involvement, but Riedler's personal papers, still held by his daughter, contain a series of receipts from 1945 in a currency mixture of Reichsmarks and Swiss francs that correspond precisely to the financial accounting in Voss's journal. The second major waypoint, approximately March 16th to 18th, is the South Tyrol, specifically the farmhouse near Toblach that investigators had already identified from the map annotations. This is the point at which the network's organizational complexity becomes fully apparent, because the Toblach farmhouse was not operating exclusively for Voss. It was a transit node. The farm, belonging to an ethnic German South Tyrolean family named Hofer, no relation to surveyor Magdalena Hofer, served, based on financial records recovered from Italian National Archives in April 2025, as a waypoint for at least 11 individuals transiting southward in the period between February and May 1945. Not all of these individuals were ordinary officers fleeing prosecution. 3 of them cross-referenced against Allied war crimes investigation files declassified by the International Tracing Service in Arolsen, Germany, in 2019, were SS officers with direct involvement in mass atrocities. The Toblach farmhouse connection is the darkest dimension of the Voss case. It forces investigators to confront the question of whether Voss, whatever his personal moral complexity, was in the end a participant in a system designed at least partly to shield men whose crimes went far beyond those of an ordinary German officer following orders. The network he used, and possibly helped to construct and resource, was also a network that served war criminals. From Toblach, the route continues south through the Brenner Pass, the ancient crossing between Austria and Italy that has served as one of Europe's great movement corridors for 2,000 years, and which in March 1945 was a chaotic mix of retreating Germans, Allied air activity, and the desperate human overflow of a continent in collapse. Voss was traveling with the Steinmann Austrian engineer identity, which classified him as a civilian essential worker, a category that theoretically entitled him to crossing facilitation. The network had ensured that the appropriate stamps appeared in the Steinmann identity documents. By approximately March 22, Voss is in Bolzano, the principal city of the South Tyrol, then still under German occupation by the Wehrmacht's operational zone Alpenvorland. In Bolzano, the network's Swiss contact, Die Brücke, becomes critical. The bridge is identified by Swiss Federal Archive documents, located by Professor Halsmann's team in May 2025, as one Bertrand Favre, a Swiss Red Cross delegate from Geneva who had been operating in northern Italy since 1943, providing humanitarian assistance to civilian internees. Favre's connection to the escape network represents one of the most troubling findings of the entire investigation. A Red Cross official facilitating the movement of Wehrmacht personnel using the organization's humanitarian travel authorization system. From Bolzano, the route turns west through the Val Venosta, the upper Adige Valley, toward the Swiss border at Mouster in the Graubünden canton. This crossing was made, the evidence suggests, on approximately March 27, 1945, using the hauler Swiss identity, the Basel-born German Swiss, which entitled Voss to enter Switzerland as a returning national rather than as a refugee or prisoner of war. The Mouster crossing point was, by late March 1945, processing enormous numbers of people. A Swiss national returning home was not a figure that attracted attention. By early April 1945, with the war still technically ongoing across Europe, Karl Heinrich Voss was in Switzerland. He had traveled approximately 600 kilometers from Bad Aussee in roughly 3 weeks, using a combination of mountain tracks, vehicle transport arranged by network contacts, and the final leg on a civilian bus service operating between Bolzano and the Swiss frontier. The gold was intact. The identity documents had been used and discarded. He was now traveling as the third identity, Karl Linder, and he had, by every measure of operational planning, executed an escape of extraordinary difficulty with the methodical precision that had defined his entire military career. From Switzerland, the route's final segment leads, as investigators would reconstruct from Argentine and Swiss archive sources, to a ship departure from Genoa in late April 1945, less than 2 weeks before Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8. The trail of Karl Heinrich Voss does not go cold in Switzerland. It only becomes harder to follow, which is not quite the same thing. Swiss Federal Police records from 1945, accessed by the investigative team in cooperation with the Swiss Federal Archives in Bern in early May 2025, contain registration documents for a Karl Linder, Austrian forestry official, born Klagenfurt 1900, who registered residency in the city of Chur, Canton Graubünden, on April 11, 1945. Linder rented a furnished room from a widow named Margit Frischknecht for a period of 3 weeks. Frischknecht died in 1987, but her grandson, reached by the investigation team, still has a letter his grandmother kept in a shoe box. A note left by her tenant when he departed in late April 1945, thanking her for her hospitality, enclosing 3 Swiss franc notes more than the agreed rent, and written in a handwriting that Dr. Worm's forensic analysis confirms, with a 93% confidence rating, is identical to the handwriting in the Bad Aussie Planning Journal. Linder Voss departed Chur on approximately April 28, 1945. The route from Chur to Genoa, through the Swiss-Italian border at Chiasso, is a matter of approximately 4 hours by train. In Genoa, a city in chaos as Allied forces and Italian resistance fighters fought for control of northern Italy's industrial heartland, a man named Karl Linder purchased passage on a Portuguese merchant vessel, the São Benedito, registered in Lisbon, that departed the port of Genoa on May 2, 1945, bound for Buenos Aires via the Canary Islands. The passenger manifest of the São Benedito, recovered from Portuguese National Maritime Archives by the investigation team in May 2025, lists Karl Linder, occupation engineer, nationality Austrian, in third-class cabin accommodation. The São Benedito arrived in Buenos Aires on June 3, 1945. Germany had surrendered 26 days earlier. The war that Karl Heinrich Voss had spent 23 years of his life serving was over. The country that had taken his family from him was in ruins. And Voss himself was standing on a dock in Argentina in the early winter of the Southern Hemisphere, watching the São Benedito unload its cargo in the brown water of the Rio de la Plata, with 12 years of additional documented life ahead of him. Argentine immigration records from 1945, accessed through the Dirección Nacional de Migraciones in Buenos Aires, show the entry of Karl Linder on June 3rd. The immigration card lists his profession as engineer, his address in Austria as Klagenfurt, consistent with the forged identity, and his intended residence in Argentina as the city of Córdoba in the central Pampas province of Córdoba, approximately 700 kilometers northwest of Buenos Aires. Córdoba in 1945 was home to a substantial German-speaking immigrant community, including many Austrians and Volga Germans who had settled there in the late 19th century. It was also, as subsequent investigations would document extensively, a city where a number of former German military and government officials established themselves in the immediate post-war years. The clearest evidence that Karl Linder of Córdoba was Karl Heinrich Voss of Kassel comes not from official documents, but from a series of letters discovered in the estate of a woman named Helena Schreiber, who died in the Argentine city of Mendoza in 2002. Helena Schreiber was the daughter of a German-Argentine schoolteacher, and she had, for reasons that were not immediately apparent to the executors of her estate, preserved a collection of 21 letters written in German over a period running from 1948 to 1957. The letters were found in a locked metal box in Schreiber's basement. They were donated to the local archive in Mendoza in 2008, where they sat unread and uncatalogued for 17 years until the Bad Aussie investigation prompted Argentine archivists to search their holdings for relevant materials. The letters were from a man who identifies himself only as K, writing to a woman in Germany named Berta, subsequently identified as Berta Voss, née Richter, Karl Voss's younger sister, born in Kassel in 1906. The letters are astonishing documents. They never directly name the sender. They are written with a careful awareness that they might be intercepted or read by authorities, but their content, decoded by Professor Halsman and his team, is unambiguous. Kay describes, across 21 letters, the life of a man living under a false name in Cordoba, working as a private engineering consultant for agricultural infrastructure projects in the province. He describes the landscape, the flat plains, the dry heat, the strange southern stars. He describes his routine, his solitude, his work. He describes in the later letters a declining health, a heart condition first mentioned in a letter dated March 1954. And in a letter dated December 1956, Kay writes to his sister Berta, "There are days when I go to the window in the morning and cannot remember who I am supposed to be. Not Carl Linder, the other one, the one who stood at the maps in Graz while the front fell apart and decided that he would not be consumed along with everything else. I am tired, Berta. The arithmetic of survival grows heavier each year, but I was right to do what I did. I was right. The war had no more claim on me after it took them." The final letter in the collection is dated November 3, 1957. It is brief. Kay tells his sister that his heart has been troubling him badly for several weeks, that he has made arrangements, that he has no regrets. He does not say goodbye. The letter simply ends. Carl Linder, Karl Heinrich Voss, disappears from Argentine records after 1957. No death certificate for a Carl Linder has been located in Cordoba provincial records for that year. The investigation team believes, based on the medical references in the final letters and the cessation of all traceable documentary evidence, that Voss died sometime in late 1957 or early 1958, at approximately 56 or 57 years of age. If the death was registered under a different name, a third false identity, which is possible, that record has not yet been found. He left no known descendants. He is buried, if buried anywhere in Argentina, under a name that no one living knows. The question that hovers over the entire Voss case, over the mountain room, over the planning journal, over the 21 letters to a sister in Kassel, is a question that every investigation into wartime escape ultimately confronts. What is the moral weight of this man's survival? Karl Heinrich Voss was not Heinrich Himmler. He was not an architect of the Holocaust, not a commandant of a death camp, not an interrogator of prisoners. The investigative record assembled in 2025 contains no direct evidence that Voss personally committed war crimes, no testimony placing him at atrocities, no documentation of orders he gave that resulted in civilian deaths. He was a staff officer, a planner, a man who moved units across maps. In the taxonomy of German military culpability that post-war tribunals spent decades attempting to construct, Voss sits in the morally complicated middle ground where so many officers of his generation reside. And yet, he was a senior officer of an army that prosecuted a war of annihilation across Eastern Europe with deliberate systematic brutality. His planning work, specifically his contribution to the supply and logistics infrastructure of German forces operating in the Balkans and northern Italy from 1942 to 1944, directly supported operations that included mass reprisal killings of Yugoslav civilians by German and German allied forces. He is not responsible for ordering those killings, but the machine he served and kept running was the machine that carried them out. And then there is the matter of the network. The escape route that carried Voss from Bad Aussie to Buenos Aires also carried, through the Toblach farmhouse and the Brenner corridor, at least 3 individuals who were, by any legal and moral standard, war criminals. Men who had supervised the murder of civilians. Men who received no justice because a system existed to prevent them from facing it. Voss may not have built that system, but he used it. And in using it, he was a participant in the broader project of ensuring that the full accounting of Nazi Germany's crimes would never be complete. There are also the victims to consider, not abstract victims, specific ones. The Yugoslav civilian population subjected to German reprisal operations in 1943 and 1944, some of which the supply infrastructure VAS helped maintain made operationally possible. Those people had names. They had families. They received no letter explaining what had happened. They received no justice. And the officer whose planning work was part of the apparatus that destroyed them spent his final years watching the southern stars from a window in Cordoba, writing to his sister about the arithmetic of survival. Professor Halsman, in his preliminary public statement about the Bad Aussie discovery released on April 25, 2025, addresses this directly. We are capable of recognizing the tragedy of a man who lost his family and his country simultaneously, and the considerable intelligence and courage required to do what Voss did, without allowing that recognition to obscure the fundamental fact that he escaped accountability for his role in a war of profound moral catastrophe. These are not mutually exclusive observations. The capacity to hold both simultaneously is, perhaps, what historical honesty requires. The Voss case also raises a question that the discovery of the Bad Aussie chamber makes newly urgent. How many others were there? The escape network documented in the planning journal used the Toblach farmhouse as one node. Investigators have identified at least 7 other possible nodes across the Alpine network from the map annotations and coded letters. Full investigation of each of those nodes, to the extent that 80-year-old evidence permits, could take years. Each node potentially represents additional escapees, additional individuals who never faced justice, additional evidence of institutional complicity in the immediate post-war cover-up. The 17 families of men documented in the Allied war crimes investigation files whose cases were never prosecuted because the subjects had disappeared. Those families, or their descendants, are owed an accounting. The evidence now emerging from a mountain chamber in the Austrian Alps is, 81 years later, the beginning of that accounting. It is not, even now, the end of it. It is May 2025. The access shaft above Bad Aussie has been expanded, reinforced, and fitted with permanent stairs. The chamber itself has been documented down to the last millimeter. Every item has been catalogued, tested, and transferred to conservation facilities at the Österreichisches Staatsarchiv in Vienna. The planning maps are being digitized at ultra-high resolution. The journal and the personal letters are being transcribed. The 42 gold coins and 14 gold bars, still present in a canvas bag at the base of the chamber wall when investigators entered, have been transferred to the Austrian government as property subject to international legal review. The chamber itself, the room that Voss sealed on November 10, 1944, and last visited on March 12, 1945, will not be demolished. The decision, announced by the Styrian regional government and the Austrian Federal Ministry of Arts, Culture, Civil Service and Sport on April 30, 2025, is to preserve it as a historically protected site and to develop it over the coming years as part of a memorial and educational facility connected to the broader documentation of the war's final phase in the Alpine region. There are plans for a small museum in Bad Aussie itself. There are plans for guided historical tour. There is discussion of a partnership with the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance in Vienna to integrate the Voss materials into the broader narrative of the war's end and its imperfect reckoning. The table is still in the room. The investigators chose, for reasons both practical and symbolic, to leave it where it stands, the long wooden table with the drawer pulls worn smooth by years of use, the surface still carrying the faint rectangular outlines of maps that lay on it for 8 decades. The table will be the centerpiece of the exhibition. Visitors will stand over it and look at the space where a man sat in 1944 and 1945, listening to the shortwave radio, writing in his journal, and planning with extraordinary precision how to become someone else entirely. Dr. Kastner, speaking to reporters at the press conference held in Bad Aussie on May 2nd, described walking into the chamber for the first time with an image that has stayed with everyone who read her account. The lights came on and the room was just there, exactly as he had left it. The maps on the table, the compass, the sealed canisters against the wall. 8 decades of mountain air and stone, and nothing had disturbed it. It was like walking into someone's thoughts, like the mountain had been keeping them for him. The mountain had been keeping them for him. For 81 years, through the end of the war, through the Nuremberg trials, through the reconstruction of Germany and Austria, through the Cold War and its end, through the full arc of the second half of the 20th century and the opening of the 21st, while former colleagues died and archives opened, and historians slowly reconstructed the full picture of those catastrophic years. A ridge of limestone above the Salzkammergut had been holding one man's secret in careful, silent, 8-degree custody. Karl Heinrich Voss died, almost certainly, in Cordoba in late 1957 or early 1958. He died as Karl Linder, a man with no military record, no family, no history worth speaking of to his Argentine neighbors. He died, as best the evidence suggests, alone, having outlived his wife and children by 14 years, having outlived the country that destroyed them by 12, having outlived the identity he spent 23 years building by 13. He died under a false name in a foreign city, writing letters to a dead woman and a dead war, and whatever accounting he made of his choices in those final days, he made it in private, in a language that no one alive could hear. The mountain kept his secret, but mountains, it turns out, do not keep secrets forever. Sometimes the earth holds what history refuses to acknowledge, holding it in cold storage, in the dark, in perfect quiet for decades, for generations, for the full span of a human life and beyond, holding it until the right instrument is pointed at the right ridge on the right March morning, until the radar bounces back wrong, until an orange flag goes into the ground and someone says, "There is something here that we did not know about." There is always something. Somewhere in the Alps, somewhere beneath the cold salt lakes of Austria, somewhere in the forest floor of the Hürtgen or the mud of the Pripyat marshes or the depths of a Mediterranean harbor. There are rooms, sealed chambers, sunken cases, buried canisters that hold evidence of what was done and who survived it and how. The investigators who opened the Bad Aussie chamber believe, based on the network map annotations, that there are at least 3 more sites connected to the same escape network that have never been examined. They have applied for survey permits for 2 of them. The mountain gave up its secret in 2025. But think about this as you close this chapter of the story. If one man, one intelligent, methodical, grief-stricken officer with access to engineering resources and a cold-eyed understanding of how to move unseen through difficult terrain, if one man could seal a room so perfectly that it survived 81 years intact, could plan an escape so precisely that it remained undetected across 8 decades of historical research, could become someone else so completely that his real name appeared on no record anywhere in the world for over half a century. How many others did the same? How many other mountains are still keeping their secrets? And what is buried beneath the ground where you are standing right now, watching these words, in the deep quiet below the surface of a history that has not finished revealing itself? Sometimes the mountain keeps its secrets for 81 years. The question that should keep you awake is, which mountains haven't spoken yet?